There was unprecedented media hype when Donald Trump assumed office in Washington. The simple fact was that a lot of hopes had been raised that Donald Trump would be able to usher in a period of peace to calm down the raging wars all around the globe. Donald Trump did manage peace in the Middle East, but his promise to ensure that within 24 hours of his taking over, there would be a ceasefire in Russia versus Ukraine could not materialize at all. Why? It merits an analysis as to why that much hyped ceasefire did not happen. Donald Trump's pointsman for the peace talks between Russia and Ukraine was Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg. The Kellogg plan was very simple. Kellogg's anchor premise was that he wanted to bring about a frozen conflict. He wanted to ensure a situation in which there were no victors, no vanquished, there was nobody who won the war. It would turn out to be a stalemate, it would turn out to be a draw a la Korea. The Korean War was the model in which Keith Kellogg was working to bring about a frozen conflict. Now, as we all know, North and South Korea, aided by China and the United States respectively, had fought one another to an absolute standstill. And that standstill was then frozen along the 37th parallel, which became the demarcation line, and a demilitarized zone was established between North and South Korea to freeze the conflict in perpetuity, to freeze the conflict forever. Now, let's not forget that Joe Biden had started this war not to go in for a frozen conflict, not to go in for a stalemate or a draw. Frankly, Biden's very ambitious plan was to use Ukraine as a battering ram, use Ukraine to poke Russia in the eye to an extent that Russia would be forced to invade to safeguard its vital national interests, right? And the simple fact is that once this conflict was triggered, Ukraine would be used as a battering ram to bleed Russia white. And the conflict would then be used as an excuse to impose crippling sanctions. Let me be very candid. Let me stress this fact. The American plan was to wage an economic war, use the Russia-Ukraine conflict as a casus belli to wage an unrestricted economic war against Russia. And just like the Soviet Union had been collapsed in 1990, collapse Russia economically, ensure regime change in Moscow. Those were the ambitious targets of Joe Biden's plan to start the war in Europe, to pivot from Asia back to Europe, and to fight the war that he always wanted to fight. You know, he had hurriedly wound down the Afghan war in a most disastrous manner to get ready for his favorite conflict in Ukraine, which he thought he would end up like Ronald Reagan, who had brought Russia to the Soviet Union to its knees without firing a shot. So this proxy war was to yield the same results a la 1990, the Soviet collapse. There was to be yet another collapse of the Russian economy, this time triggered by the sanctions. I'm afraid that is not the way it turned out. Russia was able to ride out the economic sanctions thanks to China and India, which continued to purchase Russian oil in a major way to make up for the blockage of its oil and gas sales to Europe and elsewhere. Russian economy, instead of collapsing, has prospered. Its GDP is 4% GDP rise it has witnessed after the war started. It is in a much better economic condition now than it was prior to the war. So much about bringing about engineering and economic collapse. Now, the simple fact is, in a brutal slog of attrition, Russia has now gained the upper hand militarily. It is winning, clearly winning the ground war. Zelensky can do tokenism by drone strikes, high optic media visibility strikes of drones on Russian oil refineries, etc. Well, in the final analysis, they amount to very little. The ground war in Ukraine is irrevocably being lost. Russia is advancing on all fronts, slowly but relentlessly. Give it a few months more and the collapse in Ukraine, the military collapse, is inevitable. It's all over bar the shouting. So how does the West save face? You started with grandiose ambitions to, force Putin to fly out of Moscow to God knows where, but it has ended up with a fair amount of egg on the collective Western face. They don't want to be seen to be losing. They are sore losers. Quite obviously, they don't want to be seen to be losing this war, and therefore the best solution for them is what Keith Kellogg is trying to engineer: a draw, a stalemate, a frozen conflict, frozen in situ, in perpetuity, so that there are no victors, there are no vanquished, nobody won, nobody lost. We fought Russia to a standstill. We didn't lose. I mean, that is now the sum and substance of the entire diplomatic efforts those are being put in by the United States and by Donald Trump to end this conflict. Why does Donald Trump want to end this conflict? Firstly, it is not his war, it is Biden's war. Number two, far, far more important, Donald Trump wants an era of peace and quiet to commence his presidential tenure, so that he can consolidate. America is in dire need of consolidation. Donald Trump has to consolidate economically. Donald Trump has to consolidate militarily. There has been reckless expenditure of ammunition stocks, missile stocks, anti-ballistic missile stocks, surface-to-air ballistic missile stocks, ammunition. You are reaching the end of the supply chain. So you need to reconsolidate. Donald Trump wants to fight and destroy the deep state in America. Not an easy task by any stretch of the imagination. He can't be fighting wars in Ukraine and Middle East and Taiwan and yet hope to deal with the deep state in peace and quiet, right? The simple fact is that Donald Trump needs that era of consolidation. He needs an era of peace to begin with. That is why he is keen to end this war. And to end this war, he had chosen Keith Kellogg. The simple fact is that the basic data that Keith Kellogg worked on was provided by the CIA. Now, let me be absolutely candid. It is the CIA which is fighting a proxy war on behalf of Ukraine against the Russians. CIA is in charge of this conflict. CIA and Anthony Blinken, of the former Secretary of State of the United States, they are the ones waging the war against Russia. Ukraine is just a proxy. Now, the CIA's estimate of Russian casualties was rather self-congratulatory. It was, very subjective, and when you get subjective, you are on dangerous territory when war fighting is concerned. You have to be objective, you have to be realistic. The CIA told Donald Trump that Russia had suffered 1 million casualties, that Russia, their tongue was hanging out, they were about to collapse, they were about to give in, Putin was about to flee. I mean, all that subjective wish fulfillment can't be the basis for policy prescription. If you tell Donald Trump that Russia has had it, they are about to collapse, and if you give the Russians an off ramp, if you give the Russians escape hatch, Putin will desperately grab it for all that he is worth, and he'll beg for a ceasefire, he'll gratefully accept a ceasefire. Says who? Says who? The actual position is just about the reverse. Russia has suffered about 500,000 casualties, where Ukraine has suffered more than 1 million. If there is one country whose tongue is hanging out, if there is one country which is on the brink of collapse, it is not Russia. It is Ukraine. It is Ukraine. Manpower, they have hit the bottom of the barrel. The CIA is now forcing them to lower the recruitment age from 25, the conscription age from 25 to 18, under the guise of which they are picking up teenagers from the streets and throwing them into battle after about a week or a few days of basic military training. Cannon fodder. I mean, America has actually fought the Russians to the last Ukrainian. The end of that slip, the end slip is coming in Ukraine. Not only in terms of manpower, also in terms of equipment and above all ammunition. The United States is cutting off aid anymore. Europe is faltering, and the prospect for Ukraine are getting bleaker by the hour. In the east, Russia is advancing on all fronts. Petrovsk, that critical linchpin, is about to fall. They are making gains in the Kharkiv sector. They are making gains in the Zaporizhzhia sector. They are about, within a month or 2 months, give it at the outermost, the Russians would have reached the Dnieper. In the Kursk salient, they have cleared the Ukrainians out of 60% of their territory, and they are relentlessly pressing forward. They are bringing in more Koreans. There is even talk of the Chinese being brought in to gain combat experience in this combat laboratory. So, for all practical purposes, Russia has won. So, what kind of an off-ramp are you offering Russia? Russia says, after great amount of expenditure in men and material, I have finally gained the upper hand. I am now winning. I am on the victory roll. Why should I stop the offensive now and throw away all my gains? I will have to press relentlessly ahead to bring it to a logical conclusion, and a ceasefire now just does not suit Russia. Number one. Number two, the Keith-Kellogg plan talks of a ceasefire in situ. That means Russia keeps whatever it has gained in the Donbass, in Crimea, etc. But not only does it gain all that it has won, but then there is a demilitarized zone to be established, which will be manned by NATO troops. Now, this is a no-brainer. This is a disruptor of the highest order. The simple fact is, Russia fought this brutal war. Russia sacrificed so much to keep the NATO out of Ukraine. For God's sake, if we don't understand this basic fact, we don't understand Russia, we don't understand the real causes of the war, and unless we understand those causes rationally and objectively, we are going to go wrong in all our analysis. Russia said the whole war was fought to keep NATO out of Ukraine. NATO was expanding continually. The last red lines of Russia were Georgia and Ukraine, and it has reacted in both. Russia, it is an existential war for Russia. It is an existential crisis. To glibly say, okay, fine, you fought, you won, but now we will get European boots on the ground, is to negate all that Russia fought for. And I don't see Vladimir Putin accepting it in any form or manner, this kind of a denouement. You won, but we will make you sign the surrender clause, we will make you accept NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine. I'm sorry, that is the non-starter. It's a non-starter. As an anchor premise, it is deeply, deeply flawed. So when this reality check was registered in Washington, quite obviously Donald Trump was quite miffed. He had hoped a lot that he would be able to offer Russia an off-ramp. He would go down, he would make a big splash, a big start, a very good start by ending the war in the Middle East, ending the war in Russia, Ukraine, and focusing on consolidation, reconstruction, rebuilding the United States from the grassroots up as he wanted to do. This has been a bit of a spoiler, a major spoiler. So therefore, we found reassessment in Washington, we found a reality check in Washington, and now instead of peace in 24 hours, there is talk of 100 days. Peace in 100 days, and Good Friday or the 9th of May are being touted as dates on which the ceasefire will be announced, and European troops will put boots on the ground. Once again, unless we are able to work our way around that roadblock, I don't even see the 9th May deadline coming to fruition. We hope and pray like hell that it does, because it is a brutal, unnecessary conflict now for the world. It needs to end. There is no second guessing that particular factor. But the question is how? How will this very well-intentioned denouement of stopping this genocidal war be achieved? The answer Keith Kellogg has given is coercion, pressure on Russia, force it. And Donald Trump has stated in unequivocal terms that Russia will be destroyed if it does not stop this war, that we will impose tariffs and taxes and sanctions. The simple fact is Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world. But what is at play is an old playbook. This is very important to understand. United States collapsed the Soviet Union in 1990 without firing a shot. How did it do that? By creating an oil glut, by putting the price of oil in free fall. In 1986, it had prevailed upon Saudi Arabia to create an oil glut, to flood the world with oil, cheap oil. The price of oil had then been brought down from $30 a barrel to just $10 a barrel. And the Soviet economy had been torpedoed, had been destroyed, had been finished. And the Soviet Union splintered into 15 states and went down the tube of history without a single shot being fired. Keith Kellogg's idea is to replicate that old playbook of 1990, which had worked so well against the Soviet Union. So once again, we hear talk of an oil glut being created and the price of oil being brought down to $45 a barrel, the magic figure that will collapse the Russian economy and make it incapable of prosecuting any war, imperil its continued existence as a nation state, as had happened in 1990. The aim is to replay this very, very alluring example of 1990, which had led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Can it be redone? Can $45 a barrel collapse the Russian economy? Very critical, very vital, very important question. So like I said, let us analyze this $45 a barrel scenario, which is supposed to bring the Russian economy crashing down. This is the threat that Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg has advised Donald Trump, that he should put this pressure on Russia to force it to the negotiating table, right? This merits deep analysis, because it is a very vital question. The simple fact is that the oil prices are hovering around $78 a barrel now. Russia, the extraction, for Russia to keep extracting oil, it needs to have oil at $41 a barrel, because overall Russian extraction costs are quite low. It may be high in the Siberian permafrost regions, but otherwise in Russia it is fairly low, and it needs $41 a barrel to keep extracting oil. Beyond that, it would be economically unviable for the Russians to extract oil at all. But it would need prices between $70 to $80 a barrel to keep its economy afloat and to afford a war. Therefore, if you bring it down to $45 a barrel, poof, Russia goes down the tube of history, even as the Soviet Union had done. Very attractive in theory. Is it feasible in practice? To create an oil glut like in 1986, the United States will have to take major help of Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia, the extraction costs are the lowest in the world at $10 a barrel. But yet, the Saudi economy has also to stay afloat, and it also needs prices in the range of $70 to $80 a barrel to stay afloat, because after all, oil is a fast depleting resource. So, how long, how far will Saudi Arabia go to torpedo its own interests in trying to create an oil glut under American pressure is also a question mark. Donald Trump's influence over Saudi Arabia is far more than Joe Biden. Joe Biden had gone on the war path with Saudi Arabia and then had to eat crow, because Saudi Arabia just joined the BRICS. So, the simple fact is, I am not very sure how far Saudi Arabia would be willing to harm its own economic interests, geo-economic interests in trying to create an oil glut just to do Russia in. Russia and Saudi Arabia have much better relations now. Russia and China and Saudi Arabia and Iran, they have much better relations now. So, whether Saudi Arabia would play ball is a big question mark, number one. Number two, unintended consequences. Scott Ritter, I have a lot of regards for that man, has pointed out certain very drastic unintended consequences for the American economy if the price of oil was to be brought down to $45 a barrel. Very interesting. Let me explain how. Let me explain how that would happen. The simple fact is, there are the old oil wells in the United States where the break-even price for economic extraction is about $33 a barrel. But then there are a whole lot of new wells and fracking, etc., where the break-even price even for the United States is $60 plus a barrel. $60 a barrel. It is this sector of the American oil economy that will take a big hit. All the new companies in the fray who have been encouraged by Donald Trump to frack, to pump oil like hell, to sort of to revive the United States economically, to sell oil all over the world, etc., to take part in the American economic revival. Those companies who are now investing in the new wells would be finished. The United States itself will take a hit. So, I think there is a need for a proper policy analysis to involve the oil experts, those who have been in the field of oil for a long time, to sort of do a very proper net assessment. It can't be done on hunches, unfortunately. Hunches that, if we get it down to $45 a barrel, it's like a back of the envelope calculation, and pop goes the weasel. There goes the Russian empire down the tube of history, even as the Soviet empire had vanished and splintered into 15 different states. I don't see that being repeated that easily. And therefore, there is a need for a rain check on on what are your doable policy options. Theoretical kite flying is one thing, but doable policy options needs a proper net assessment of the likes that Andy Marshall used to do. And I mean, those net assessments were the basis of engineering the Soviet collapse in 1990. We'll have to go in for a proper net assessments here before we jump the gun. Why does Russia not want a ceasefire? Three basic reasons. First of all, Russia has gained the upper hand militarily. Therefore, for it to now stop, throw away all its hard-earned gains at such great cost in lives and treasure, and stop when it is gained the momentum, it is advancing relentlessly but steadily, would be, I would say, a fatal military mistake. Russia has no option but to keep grinding till it reaches a breakthrough. So this is hardly the opportune time to expect Russia to go in for a ceasefire militarily. At least another 30 to 60 days it would need to bring it to a logical, viable military conclusion and stabilize the border with Ukraine on the banks of the Dnieper River. Also throw every single Ukrainian out of Kursk, and maybe just to sort of ensure that its points were made, go for an offensive towards Odessa or towards Kyiv, most likely Kyiv. So militarily the timing was inopportune for Russia, and it has said so in so many words very, very plainly. They see no reason to commit harakiri to placate Washington. They have very little reason to placate Washington. They are winning. So why should they turn a victory into defeat for no rhyme or reason is what beggars the imagination. Number two, the core rationale for Russia fighting the Ukraine war was to keep NATO out of Ukraine, which it viewed as an existential threat. It still is. It still is. You have a ceasefire in situ and you repeat what happened in Syria. The Russians accepted a ceasefire in situ in Syria. They took 4 years, the CIA and the others and the Israelis and the Turks, to rebuild that jihadi coalition, and they attacked again when Russia was tied down hand and foot in Ukraine, and they inflicted a defeat in Syria, a local defeat in Syria. There are no two doubts on that scenario. So Russia is not likely to repeat that same Syrian error all over again, and Russia is absolutely not likely to accept NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine. Any peace anchor premise that starts with does not deal with this mind block is not going to go very far. Thirdly, Russia says, yes, it is prepared to talk peace even with Ukraine, but with a government that is legitimate, and the peace deals that it signs would be binding to future Ukrainian governments. Zelensky has outlived his use-by date. His tenure had ended many months back. He should have resigned, held elections, and regained his mandate to govern. He has not. He used the excuse of the war to declare emergency and say no elections were possible. Russia is also fighting this war. They have held elections. I don't think that washes. And the regime in Ukraine, in Kyiv, that is being touted around as the acme of democracy for the rest of the world to emulate, I'm sorry, is very undemocratic, very corrupt, so thoroughly corrupt that they are now asking $200 billion that the Americans gave. Where is that money? Only about 70 odd billion seems to have reached Ukraine. So, I mean, the Russians are saying anybody but Zelensky. And Zelensky, by the way, had come in on the premise that once he won the elections with 80% majority very many years back, Now, he had done it on the premise that he would bring about peace with Russia. And what peace we have seen? He's put 1 million Ukrainians to peace. And the bloodletting goes on. So that is why Russia is not likely to accept this particular thing. But nevertheless, I think Trump is quite sincere. Trump is quite clear that for the good of America, he needs a period of peace and quiet and consolidation. It is a rational requirement, not just an emotive requirement for peace, but a rational requirement for restructuring the setup in the United States, for rebuilding the American economy, where the workers, the rich are getting richer and richer and richer, but the American working class, whose incomes had been going up, whose purchasing power had been going up and up and up for almost 100 years, is now come to a sorry pass. They can't put food on the table, they can't get affordable housing, they are in dire straits. Inflation is hitting into their budgets, price of gas and fuel they have to kept on a leash. So Donald Trump has a lot on his hands, and he can afford to do with less of distractions outside American shores right now. And Donald Trump is also very clear, his main enemy is not Russia, it is China. Main competitor is not Russia, it is China. And Biden's very, very imbecilic lurch from Asia to Europe to start a new war in Europe, which he thought he would destroy the Russian Empire, and he ended up with egg all over his face, and the American people have shown him the door. So the simple fact is that we now would wish for peace, but we have to be realistic in our appraisals. We have to take a relook at our anchor premises, and if we are serious about peace, we will have to factor in what the Russians are likely to accept, what they are not. That is the crux of this entire imbroglio.